Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this Warlord Char B1 Bis French medium tank. Was it a medium tank? I think it was considered pretty heavy at the time. Anyway, this is a plastic model in 28mm scale and it's a pretty new release from Warlord and Italeri. Before I go any further, I would like to say a big thank you to my patrons, who not only made it possible for me to purchase this model, but also voted to see it built first from a list of other cool kits they helped me purchase. Thanks guys, you are most excellent. I quite like the art on the front of the box. A battle rages on, and the Char B1 Bis fires its weapon, while the roundel on the side of the turret makes it look like it has a face. I am easily amused. The back of the box has everything you would expect to see on a Warlord box. There's some information on the tank, painted examples of 4 of the variants this kit can build, an image of the included tank commanders, 2 German and 1 French, and there's also a kind of advertisement for tank war. I guess that makes sense, this is a tank after all, so you might want to use it in tank war. Inside the box we find the flame and smoke marker kit that's become standard with newer Warlord kits. There's also a bag with 2 sprues in it. The parts on these sprues are all very neatly moulded. There are mould lines of course, but they're very minor and will be trivial to clean up. I couldn't find any defects on this model and all the parts are where they should be. The detailing is very nice, and there's a lot of rivet detail, with this tank being riveted together and all. The rivets on this model stand out without being hideously large and odd looking. Something that I like is that there are 3 commanders, 1 French and 2 German. It is a French tank, but that does make sense when you realise that there are a lot more German variants that can be built from this kit than French ones. There are quite a few odds and ends here too. Not all of them are going to be used, so there's going to be stuff left over for the bits box. The plastic in this kit is made by Italeri, and they're really getting better and better at making these 28mm kits. As is usually the case with Warlord's tanks, a decal sheet is included. There's a good amount of markings here for both French and German variants of the tank. They look decent enough, though they might be a bit hard to see against the white background. There are also 2 of these cards, one for the regular French version, and I suppose also the captured German version, and the other card is for the German Flammpanzer variants. I guess that makes sense. I don't think there needs to be a card for every Flammpanzer version, and I guess the stats don't change if the base tank is French or German, so there's no need for excess cards, even though they might have been cool to have. Also, so that we know how all the bits of plastic should go together, an instruction booklet is included. There are quite a few variants you can build from this kit, and there are instructions for all of those, which means there are some points where you'll have to pay extra attention to avoid making mistakes. Fortunately, the instructions are clear, well laid out, and easily understood. In the back there are some basic painting and marking guides. After some umming and ahhing, I decided to build the basic French version of this vehicle. I may have to get another one of these to build up later as the German Flammpanzer. I begin construction, as is often the case, with the tracks. These are larger and chunkier than the average track sets, and I think they look rather interesting. The 2 halves of the hull side go together quite easily. This is because they are keyed, so they go together correctly with minimal effort. The fit is rather good. I think that's going to be a recurring theme during this build. The drive sprocket comes next. It goes at the rear of the hull side where there's a D-shaped piece of keying for it. There's a little bit of play in this, but not too much. I think this is a really interesting design to look at. The tracks then need to be attached. I find it helpful to lay them out like this, in similar positions to the ones in which they'll be attached. That way I don't get the curved front and rear sections mixed up. There is keying for the upper run of tracks in the form of 2 slots, into which corresponding bars on the bottom of the track sets will go. This works very well, and the track part goes on very nicely indeed. I then attach the front curved track part. I actually put this around the wrong way, but was able to remove and reattach it correctly before the glue set. If you look at them from the side, the track links overlap each other at one end. The trick is to make sure the overlap is consistent all the way around the run of tracks. The lower section of track has the same sort of keying as the upper part, so it goes into place neatly and easily, though I do apply a little pressure just to be sure the parts stay together properly. Next, the rear curved section goes on. It's pretty easy to tell if you've got this part around the wrong way. I glue it into place. I found I had to apply a bit of pressure to make the gaps in the side of the track parts less obvious. There is of course a second set of tracks to put together, and that's done exactly the same way as the first, only using different parts. Now for the rest of the hull. The hull top has a variety of holes that need to be drilled out, depending on which version of the model you're building. For the regular French tank I'm building, there are only 2 holes to open. Actually 1 hole and 1 slot. Drilling the hole is the easy part. I found it to be a bit small, so I expanded it with my knife, probably accidentally making it a little bit too large. Oh well, worse things have happened. I then carefully cut out the rectangular slot. It was fiddly, but it is obviously doable. I much prefer doing this than having to fill in unwanted holes. Next, I build the 75mm howitzer for the lower front hull. This is made up of 3 parts. I slot the gun barrel through the mantlet-y part, whatever you might call that. I'm pretty sure the gun could be put in either way up. I then add glue. This could be left so that it elevates and depresses, but as usual, that doesn't much appeal to me, so I glue it all into place. The back part goes on easily, and then I move the gun to the angle of elevation I want it to be at, keeping in mind the triangular part of this assembly will face the bottom of the tank's hull. I set that aside to dry, and then I glue the tracks onto the hull bottom. There's a couple of slots and corresponding protrusions for keying here, which enables these parts to go together very easily. The angled shape of the hull sides and bottom also helps quite a bit in getting everything lined up nice and straight. If you want to be sure everything is aligned correctly, you could use the upper hull to check. I've got to say the ease with which these parts went together was pretty satisfying. Next comes the hull rear plate. This is keyed and goes into place super easy. I hold it in place and add glue from inside the hull just to try and make things look a little bit neater. Look at that ass. Now for some slightly more complicated assembly. The front of this tank was designed a little bit oddly. What I mean by that is some of the axle bits are exposed. First, I install this shackle part. It goes in against the front right idler wheel here. I pressed it all the way in with my knife because it was a little bit tricky to get my finger in there. Then comes this section of hull wall with 2 pieces of axle sticking out of it. There's keying to help position this, but there's still a fair bit of play in it, so you'll have to nudge it around to get it to fit properly. I add glue and make sure all the parts are lined up as best as I can get them. This is an odd piece of design. I like it because, well, it's unusual and interesting. It's obviously been designed like this to allow some clearance for the howitzer. Now it's time to install the howitzer. This is pretty easy. There's some keying in the bottom of the hull for this. It kind of locks the assembly into place as you push it forwards against the front of the hull. I then test fit the upper hull. As we know, test fitting is a good idea. It doesn't quite fit perfectly at the rear, so I apply a little bit of pressure and it clicks into place. This is fine. So I go ahead and apply glue, and unsurprisingly, it goes together nicely. I do of course have to press down on the right rear again, and I had to apply pressure at the front of the hull to try and minimize gaps there too, but in the end it goes together quite well. There's also a very slight gap above the howitzer mantlet, but I don't think that's a huge deal and it could easily be filled. I then add the exhaust pipes. The guide pins make it almost impossible to do this wrong. Next, into the rectangular hole I had to cut earlier, I glue this cup-like thing. This is the base for an antenna, which will come later. And then, this thing. Maybe it has to do with the antenna. It goes into place easily thanks to the guide pins. I did make the rear hole a little bit too big, but that's not too much of an issue, and it can also be filled in later if so desired. This and the previous part are for the French tanks only. I then turn my attention to the front of the hull and add the spare track links. There's a little protrusion on the back of this that slots into the front of the hull like so. Very easy. I'm not sure if there's a correct way up to place this part, but it looks right to me. Next comes this lift point and shackle part. This has a kind of angled cutaway so that it slots over the pointed edge of the hull front. I then install this headlamp, which seems to have a lid. Who doesn't want a lid on their headlamps? Tweezers made this part easier to install. Even so, it was still a little bit fiddly to get on right, but I did eventually get there, and I think it looks decent. Next come the rear shackly things. These go on just as easily as at the front, and unlike the front one, you can see these ones a little bit better. I think the angled cutout that matches with the angle on the hull is a good piece of design. It ends up looking nice and gap-free. Once again, dat ass. Let's add some hooks. These are tiny fiddly parts, and they were a bit of a challenge to remove mould lines from. Fortunately, those mould lines weren't too bad to begin with. There are 4 of these hooks, and if you use tweezers, it's easy enough to install them into the 4 holes on the rear plate. There are some chains that can be added here. I would definitely suggest allowing the glue to bond properly before trying to apply these. I used a round file to enlarge the point where the chain would be hanging off the hooks, and it does look a little bit messy. I wasn't able to get the chain to sit over the hooks without doing this. They're not strong enough to handle a lot of force. To be fair, as far as plastic moulded chains go, these do look pretty good, but you might want to use some metal chain here instead for a more realistic look. I hung the chain on the lower set of hooks, because they would have interfered with the chain too much if I'd hung it on the upper set. Then comes this thing that goes on the rear. I'm pretty sure this is a pair of jacks, and it looks like this part could be installed either way around. It fits into place very nicely. The reason I think these are jacks is because they're for the French tank only, and the German one has other parts that I can more easily identify as jacks. Next comes the antenna. This is super easy, not much to say about that. Then comes this thing. I guess it might be another antenna, or maybe just some grab railings. It was kind of fiddly and a little annoying to install. You need to flex the part quite a lot. There's a bit of tension in the part when you hold it in place, so you have to be sure that it's dried enough before you let it go, or it will just pop right out of its hole. I got it in place eventually though. I then attached the front of the driver's position. I'm pretty sure this is just a vision device here and it doesn't open. There is a hatch on top of this part anyway. There's keying on the back of this part and it goes into place super easy. And with that, the hull is complete. The German version does have a few more tools and stuff like that to add, which should look pretty cool. I'm not sure why the French didn't put shovels, picks and axes on this tank. Oh well, on to the turret. I start by assembling the guns, using all these little pieces. This is the front of the turret and it should be up this way, with the slightly raised bit around the right hand opening, which is on the left side from our perspective. Into that part, the inner part of the gun can be inserted. The right hand side of this part is very slightly longer than the left. I put these 2 parts together and then glue the back on. You can of course glue this together more carefully than I've done and have the guns elevate and depress. Next comes the machine gun, which is moulded into its mantlet. This goes into place here on the left, from the tank's perspective. The connection is keyed, but there's still a fair bit of play in it, so try to make sure it's on nice and straight. The 47mm gun's mantlet goes into place in pretty much exactly the same way. I chose to leave that gun off until I put this assembly into the turret. I feel like it might take a little bit of force to get it into the turret and it would be easier to do without the gun getting in the way. I then glue the 2 halves of the comically small turret together. It goes together easily and there's only the barest hint of a gap there. Very nice. I then install the gun assembly. The fit was a little bit tight and the gun definitely would have got in the way. I add glue, apply pressure, and it goes into place fairly well. It doesn't look perfect, but it does look fairly good. Then, it would make sense to install a 47mm gun. I rather like that the end of this barrel didn't need to be drilled out, which saves me a little bit of extra work. Next comes the commander's hatch. This can be modelled open, and the open hatch part has some detail on the inside, which is nice. This is very easy to put into place. I was tempted to model this open and have the commander sitting on his hatch, but I decided against it because, well, I like my tanks buttoned down and I'm still not sure if I'm going to paint this German or French. I then install these hooks. As you can probably see, these are tiny little parts, very fiddly to install and get nice and straight. Tweezers do help to a degree. Eventually, I got them into place. Not perfectly, but they are on and they do look okay. And finally, the commander's cupola. This isn't a hatch, and it didn't open, though I believe it did rotate to allow the commander 360-degree view. The 2 halves of this are easily glued together. There is keying on these parts to make sure that you install the cupola facing the right way, but the keying was a little bit too long and was forcing the cupola to sit a little bit too high at the front. I simply trimmed that part down and it went into place just fine after that. I glue the part into place and that's it. Turret complete. And what a teeny tiny turret it is. The tabs on the bottom of the turret allow it to be locked onto the hull like so. And with that, the Char B1 Bis is now complete. I don't have any other models of this tank with which to compare this one. In fact, I don't have any other French tanks at all. Is this the start of a new French army? Maybe, maybe not. I do think the Char B1 Bis is a very interesting looking tank. It kind of reminds me of the tanks in Warhammer 40k. It just looks so different and odd in comparison to other tanks of the era, which I think is really cool. I kind of hope this model is a sign that there's more plastic French tanks coming from Warlord in the future. I think the model is a very nice, convincing representation of the Char B1 Bis. The detailing is very nice and crisp, and I really like the rivet detail. Also, there are a lot of nice gaps and vents that should be interesting to paint, and I think when it does get painted it should look quite good. Trouble is, do I paint it French? Or do I paint it German? Tough decisions. The build process was really quite enjoyable, especially after that little bit of frustration I had with the Ark Royal last week. The instructions were good and very easy to follow, especially where parts for different variants of the tank are concerned. It didn't take a lot of time to get done, and the time I did spend building was fun. Easily one of the best Warlord plastic kits I've encountered to date, and I'm really keen to get my hands on another one of these to build a Flampanzer variant. Sure, I could proxy that, but the model looks really cool. I might be starting to ramble. So, what do you think of this kit? Do you like or dislike French tanks? Why? Let me know in the comments section below. And of course, if you haven't done so already, feel free to subscribe to me here on YouTube, follow me on social media, and watch me live stream on Twitch. And if you really like the things I do, please consider helping to support the channel over at Patreon. It's the generosity and awesomeness of my patrons that allow me to buy a lot of these kits. So thanks once again, patrons. Links to all of those things are in the description below. As always, I shall return soon, so until then, keep being awesome, happy modelling, and thanks for watching. Farewell.